March 5, 1941. Supermarine Aviation Works, Southampton, England. The air raid sirens had fallen silent 3 hours ago, but the acrid smell of burning aluminum still choked the morning air. Reginald Joseph Mitchell's masterpiece, the Spitfire production line, lay in ruins. Twisted steel girders jutted from collapsed roofs like broken ribs. Machine tools worth millions of pounds were buried under rubble. The Luftwaffe's precision bombing had achieved its objective. Spitfire production at Southampton would cease for months. Chief designer Joseph Smith stood in the smoking wreckage, calculating losses that couldn't be replaced. 47 completed Spitfires destroyed, 83 in various stages of assembly obliterated. More critically, the jigs and tools required to build Supermarine's elliptical wing, the most aerodynamically efficient design ever created, were twisted beyond repair. Rebuilding would require 9 months minimum. But in a corner office that had somehow survived the bombing, a man most had dismissed as past his prime was already sketching. Sidney Cam, chief designer at Hawker Aircraft, had driven through the night from Kingston upon Thames after hearing the news. He carried with him a folder of drawings that would be labeled insane by Supermarine engineers, brilliant by test pilots, and terrifying by German fighter commanders. What nobody knew that morning, not Smith, not the Air Ministry officials surveying the damage, not the Luftwaffe intelligence analysts who would receive reconnaissance photographs showing the successful strike, was that the destruction of Supermarine's Southampton works had just triggered the creation of Britain's most lethal fighter aircraft. An aircraft built not from careful engineering and unlimited resources, but from desperation, scrap metal, and one man's refusal to accept that anything was impossible. The Hawker Typhoon would emerge from this chaos as something the aviation world had never seen, a low-altitude terror that could catch and destroy anything the Luftwaffe flew, powered by an engine so problematic that it killed nearly as many pilots as enemy action, yet so powerful that it redefined the concept of fighter-bomber operations. Sidney Cam hadn't set out to be a revolutionary. Born in 1893 in Windsor, Berkshire, the son of a master carpenter, Cam left school at 14 to work as a carpenter's apprentice. While other boys his age were learning trades, Cam spent his evenings at Windsor Public Library, devouring every book on mathematics, engineering, and the new science of aeronautics. By 1914, at age 21, Cam was working as a carpenter at Martinside Aircraft Company, building wooden aircraft frames. He studied the designs as he built them, understanding intuitively how structural loads transferred through the airframe. When designers made errors, and they often did in aviation's infancy, Cam would quietly redesign the offending components and build them correctly. His talent couldn't remain hidden. By 1923, Cam was chief designer at Hawker Engineering Company, where he would spend the next 43 years creating some of Britain's most successful aircraft. The Hart, the Fury, the Hurricane, each represented evolutionary improvements in aircraft design. But by 1937, Cam understood that evolution was no longer sufficient. The Hawker Hurricane, his greatest success to date, was already obsolescent before it entered service. Its fabric-covered wings and fixed-pitch propeller represented 1930s technology facing a 1940s war. The Spitfire, with its all-metal stressed skin construction and variable pitch propeller, represented the future. But the Spitfire was complex, expensive, and difficult to produce in quantity. Cam's response was characteristically direct. If you can't build the perfect aircraft, build the aircraft you can actually manufacture. In 1937, he began sketching what would become the Hawker Typhoon, an aircraft designed around brutal simplicity and overwhelming power rather than elegant efficiency. The design philosophy was revolutionary. Where the Spitfire prioritized altitude performance and dogfighting capability, Cam's new fighter would excel at low altitude, where it could use sheer power to overwhelm opponents. Where Mitchell's elliptical wing represented aerodynamic perfection, Cam's thick wing section prioritized structural strength and internal fuel capacity. Where the Spitfire used the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine producing 1,030 horsepower, Cam planned to install the Napier Sabre, a monstrous 24-cylinder engine producing 2,200 horsepower. The Napier Sabre itself was a masterpiece of insanity masquerading as engineering. Designed by Major Frank Halford, the engine featured 24 cylinders arranged in an H configuration, two flat 12-cylinder banks sharing a common crankshaft. The design allowed massive displacement, 37 liters, in a relatively compact package. On paper, it produced more power than any production piston engine in existence. In reality, it was a temperamental beast that required constant maintenance, suffered chronic overheating, and had a disturbing tendency to catch fire without warning. Test pilots called it the Sabre Dance, the frantic sequence of emergency procedures required when the engine decided to quit mid-flight. Major Roland Beaumont, who would become the Typhoon's greatest advocate, described his first encounter with the Sabre engine. It sounded like rolling thunder compressed into a metal box. The vibration at full power was so intense that instruments became unreadable. The engine cowling glowed red hot. Coolant leaked from dozens of joints. And the noise, dear God, the noise was something living and angry. But when it worked, the Sabre produced power that redefined what piston engines could achieve. By 1944, production variants were producing 2,400 horsepower, enough to pull the 7-ton Typhoon through the air at 412 miles an hour at low altitude, faster than any German fighter could manage below 10,000 feet. The Air Ministry's response to Cam's proposal was skeptical, bordering on hostile. Air Marshal Sir Dowding, commanding RAF Fighter Command, reviewed the preliminary specifications in November 1937 and delivered a withering assessment. This aircraft appears to be a solution in search of a problem. We have the Hurricane for general duties and the Spitfire for high-performance interception. This proposed Hawker design offers neither the Hurricane's ease of production nor the Spitfire's performance. I see no operational requirement. But Cam had powerful allies. Sir Henry Tizard, chairman of the Aeronautical Research Committee, understood that air warfare was evolving beyond 1930s assumptions. The Germans were developing heavily armored ground attack aircraft. The next generation of bombers would fly faster and lower. Britain needed a fighter optimized for low-altitude combat, where the Spitfire's high-altitude performance was wasted. Specification F-18-37 was issued in January 1938, calling for a single-seat fighter capable of 400-plus miles an hour, armed with 12.303 machine guns, and powered by either the Napier Sabre or Rolls-Royce Vulture engine. The specification was written specifically around Cam's design, although officially it was an open competition. Hawker's competitors recognized this immediately. Boulton Paul, Fairey, and Bristol all submitted proposals, but none possessed Hawker's experience with high-speed fighter design. By March 1938, Hawker received a contract for 2 prototypes. The first prototype, designated Hawker Typhoon, took shape in Hawker's Kingston facility through 1939 and 1940. The design that emerged bore little resemblance to anything previously built. Where contemporary fighters featured sleek, streamlined fuselages, the Typhoon was brutally functional. The massive Sabre engine dominated the design, its bulk requiring an enormous cowling that gave the aircraft an aggressive, predatory appearance. The wing was equally unorthodox. At over 5 feet thick at the root, it resembled a diving board more than an airfoil. But this thickness allowed internal fuel tanks holding 154 gallons, eliminating the need for external drop tanks that degraded performance. The thickness also provided torsional rigidity that prevented wing twist during high-speed maneuvers, a problem that plagued many contemporary designs. The cockpit was positioned well aft, giving the pilot a view dominated by the massive engine cowling ahead. Forward visibility during landing was virtually non-existent. Pilots learned to approach in a slip, looking out the side window, straightening only at the last moment before touchdown. The armament was devastating. 4 20mm Hispano cannon mounted in the wings, each with 140 rounds. This firepower exceeded anything in RAF service. A 2-second burst delivered over 90 rounds of 20mm shells, enough explosive power to disintegrate any aircraft in existence. Test pilot Philip Lucas took the prototype up for its first flight on February 24, 1940. His post-flight report captured the Typhoon's character. Takeoff acceleration is violent. The torque requires full right rudder to maintain directional control. Climb performance is adequate, but not exceptional. High-altitude performance is disappointing. The aircraft feels sluggish above 20,000 feet. But below 10,000 feet, the power is extraordinary. Level flight acceleration exceeds anything I've experienced. Diving acceleration is frankly terrifying. The aircraft reaches speeds where control surfaces begin to stiffen alarmingly. The visibility is poor, the cockpit cramped, the engine noise deafening, even with ear protection. The Sabre leaked coolant over the windscreen, reducing visibility further. The instrument panel vibrated so badly that reading instruments required concentration. This is not a refined aircraft, but it's fast, heavily armed, and built like a tank. For low-altitude combat, it might prove formidable. The Air Ministry's response was lukewarm. Britain was fighting for survival in summer 1940. The Hurricane and Spitfire were proving adequate for defending against high-altitude bomber formations. The Typhoon's low-altitude performance seemed irrelevant to the immediate crisis. But events were about to change that assessment. On September 7, 1940, the Luftwaffe switched tactics, beginning the Blitz, sustained bombing of British cities. The high-altitude interceptions that had characterized the Battle of Britain gave way to running battles with bombers and fighters operating below 15,000 feet, exactly where the Typhoon excelled. More significantly, the Focke-Wulf FW-190 was about to appear. German designers had created a fighter that outperformed the Spitfire Mark V below 20,000 feet. When the FW-190 entered service in August 1941, RAF Fighter Command faced its first serious crisis since the Battle of Britain. Suddenly, Britain desperately needed the low-altitude fighter it had been reluctant to build. The Typhoon's development was plagued with problems that would have killed lesser programs. The Sabre engine suffered chronic reliability issues. Sleeve valves, a sophisticated mechanism that eliminated conventional poppet valves, proved temperamental in service. Carbon buildup caused sticking. Inadequate lubrication led to seizures. The cooling system leaked constantly. More seriously, the rear fuselage had a disturbing tendency to separate from the rest of the aircraft during high-speed flight. Between September 1942 and January 1943, 11 Typhoons disintegrated in flight, killing all pilots. The investigation revealed a fundamental structural failure. The attachment points where the rear fuselage joined the forward section were inadequately designed for the aerodynamic loads generated during high-speed maneuvers. The solution required complete redesign of the attachment structure. Hawker engineers worked around the clock, testing modifications that required pulling aircraft from squadrons, strengthening them, and returning them to service. The program came within days of cancellation multiple times as the death toll mounted. Squadron leader Roland Beaumont, commanding No. 609 Squadron equipped with Typhoons, became the aircraft's most vocal defender. His October 1942 report to Fighter Command Headquarters was brutally honest. "The Typhoon has killed more of my pilots than the Luftwaffe this month. The structural failures are unacceptable. The engine reliability is inadequate. But when it works, when the pilot trusts the aircraft enough to use its performance, nothing the Germans have can match it below 10,000 feet. Yesterday, I intercepted a Focke-Wulf 190 at 8,000 feet. He saw me and ran. I pursued at full power. The Typhoon accelerated past 400 miles per hour. The German couldn't escape. I closed to 300 yards and fired a 2-second burst. The Focke-Wulf 190 came apart. Not shot down, destroyed. The 420mm cannon are devastating beyond anything I've fired before. Fix the structural issues, improve the engine reliability. Give us 6 more months. This aircraft will become the best low-altitude fighter in Europe. Beaumont's confidence proved justified, but the transformation required both technical solutions and tactical innovation. The structural problems were addressed by January 1943 through reinforced attachment points and improved inspection procedures. Engine reliability improved as Napier engineers resolved the sleeve valve issues and improved the cooling system. But the real breakthrough came when pilots stopped trying to fly the Typhoon like a Spitfire. The aircraft wasn't a dogfighter. It was a hit-and-run attacker that used speed and firepower to destroy opponents before they could react. Pilots learned to exploit the extraordinary low-altitude speed, attacking from below where German fighters couldn't follow, climbing away using power the enemy couldn't match. The FW-190 pilot who encountered a Typhoon in a turning fight had the advantage. The German fighter could turn inside the heavier British aircraft. But the FW-190 pilot who tried to escape a Typhoon in level flight or a dive was doomed. The Typhoon's power-to-weight ratio at low altitude exceeded anything in Luftwaffe service. Oberleutnant Josef Jepp Wormholler, commanding Jagdgeschwader II, encountered his first Typhoon in March 1943 during a fighter sweep over northern France. His combat report, filed with Luftwaffe headquarters, revealed grudging respect. The new British fighter is not superior in maneuverability. Our FW-190 can outturn it easily, but in speed at low altitude, it exceeds our capabilities. I pursued one at full power, diving from 5,000 meters to sea level. The British aircraft pulled away effortlessly. This is concerning. The Typhoon's true calling emerged not in air-to-air combat, but in ground attack. The thick wing that had been criticized for creating drag proved ideal for carrying ordnance. By late 1943, Typhoons were operating as fighter bombers, carrying 2 500-pound bombs or 8 60-pound rockets under the wings. The rocket projectile, officially designated RP-3, unofficially called 60-pound rockets, transformed the Typhoon from fighter to tank killer. Each projectile carried a 60-pound warhead capable of penetrating 4 inches of armor at impact angles exceeding 30 degrees. A single hit could destroy a Panzer IV. 2 hits would kill a Tiger tank. The accuracy required closing to minimum range, typically 800 yards, before firing. At that distance, German flak was devastating. Typhoon pilots accepted casualty rates that exceeded 50% over a 3-month operational period. They flew anyway, because nothing else could kill German armor from the air. Flight Lieutenant John Baldwin, flying with No. 245 Squadron, described the experience in a letter that survived him by 3 days. "We attack in pairs, diving from 8,000 feet, accelerating past 400 miles per hour. The tanks below look like toys until you're committed to the attack run. Then they grow to monstrous size. Tracer fire comes up in streams, green, red, white. You ignore it because looking at flak means death. You focus on the target, the gun sight, the firing sequence. At 1,000 yards, you can see the tank commander in his cupola. At 800 yards, you fire all 8 rockets. The aircraft bucks from recoil. You pull up immediately, hard as possible without blacking out. The G-forces crush you into the seat. Gray edges creep into your vision. You fight to stay conscious. Behind you, the rockets impact. When you hit, the target explodes. Not catches fire, explodes. Turret blown off, hull split open, ammunition cooking off. One hit can kill a Tiger. It's the only weapon we have that can. This morning, we lost Smithers. Flak caught him at 600 feet during his pullout. He crashed into a field. The Typhoon made a crater 30 feet across. Tomorrow, someone else will fly his aircraft. That's how it works. We fly until we're killed, because if we don't, the tanks reach the beaches and the invasion fails. The statistical reality of Typhoon operations was grimmer than Baldwin's letter suggested. Between January and June 1944, RAF Typhoon squadrons lost 259 aircraft to all causes, approximately 40% of the total force. Of these, 178 were lost to flak and ground fire. The remaining 81 were lost to mechanical failures, crashes, and combat with German fighters. Yet Typhoon squadrons maintained operational readiness throughout this period, flying over 25,000 combat sorties in the 6 months before D-Day. The replacement pipeline delivered fresh aircraft faster than combat could destroy them, fresh pilots faster than losses could deplete squadrons. The preparation for D-Day revealed the Typhoon's true purpose. By May 1944, 18 RAF squadrons and 3 RNZF squadrons operated Typhoons, representing over 400 operational aircraft. These units trained relentlessly in close air support, practicing coordination with ground forces, perfecting rocket and bomb attacks, developing tactics for the coming invasion. June 6, 1944. The Typhoons proved their worth immediately. Operating from forward bases in southern England, Typhoon squadrons flew over 1,200 sorties on D-Day, providing close air support for troops landing on the beaches. The distinctive sound of the Sabre engine, a deep, thundering roar unlike any other aircraft, became synonymous with Allied air supremacy. But the Typhoon's greatest achievement came during the Normandy campaign's critical phase. On July 18, 1944, British and Canadian forces launched Operation Goodwood, an armored thrust toward Caen designed to break through German defenses. The attack ran into heavily defended German positions anchored by Tiger and Panther tanks. Typhoon squadrons operating in a revolutionary new tactical system called cab rank provided on-call close air support. Aircraft orbited over the battlefield in formations of 4, responding to requests from forward air controllers within minutes. When targets were identified, typically German armor or fortified positions, Typhoons would peel off, attack, and return to the orbit. The system worked with devastating effectiveness. Obersturmbannführer Michael Wittmann, commanding the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, found his Tigers hunted relentlessly by Typhoons operating in coordinated attacks. His radio transmissions, intercepted by British intelligence, revealed growing desperation. "We cannot move in daylight. The Yabos are everywhere. They attack within minutes of our revealing our positions. Our flak is inadequate. We have lost 16 tanks in 3 days." On August 8th, Wittmann's Tiger was destroyed by rocket fire from Typhoons of No. 245 Squadron. The most successful tank commander in German history, credited with 138 tank kills, was killed by an aircraft that most had dismissed as a failure 2 years earlier. The destruction of German armor in Normandy reached catastrophic levels. During the Falaise Pocket Battle in August 1944, Typhoon squadrons claimed 137 tanks destroyed, 151 vehicles destroyed, and 56 artillery pieces destroyed in a single day, August 13th. German commanders reported that movement in daylight became suicidal. Entire panzer divisions were immobilized, unable to reposition without triggering immediate air attack. General Feldmarschall Gunther von Kluge, commanding German forces in Normandy, transmitted to Berlin on August 12, "The enemy's fighter bombers make movement impossible. Our panzers are hunted individually. Our supply columns cannot move. The British Typhoon has proved more effective than their artillery. We cannot counter this weapon." The technical specifications that had seemed inadequate in 1940 proved perfect for 1944's requirements. The Typhoon's maximum speed of 412 miles per hour at low altitude meant it could reach targets within minutes of being called. The 420mm cannon could destroy soft vehicles and suppress flak positions. The 8 RP-3 rockets could kill any German armored vehicle. The 154-gallon internal fuel capacity provided endurance for extended operations over the battlefield. The Sabre engine, despite its reputation for unreliability, proved remarkably resilient to battle damage. The liquid cooling system was vulnerable, but the engine could operate for several minutes even after sustaining significant damage. Pilots routinely returned to base with engines riddled with flak damage, coolant streaming, cylinder heads cracked, yet still producing enough power to get them home. Warrant Officer John Golly, flying with No. 181 Squadron, survived an encounter that should have been fatal. His after-action report documented what the Typhoon could withstand. "During a ground attack mission near Falaise, flak struck my aircraft. I felt impact, heard explosions, saw the engine cowling peel away. The cockpit filled with coolant vapor. The engine temperature gauge climbed past the red line immediately. Standard procedure called for immediate bailing out. But I was over German-held territory at 800 feet. Bailing out meant captivity or death. I decided to try reaching friendly lines. The engine was making sounds I'd never heard, grinding, knocking, rattling. The temperature gauge was pinned at maximum. Coolant sprayed across the windscreen, reducing visibility to almost zero. I flew by compass and clock, heading west, praying the engine wouldn't seize or catch fire. For 18 minutes, the Sabre kept running despite catastrophic damage. I crossed the front lines, spotted a field, and landed. The engine seized as I touched down, the propeller stopping instantly. Ground crew examination revealed that 3 cylinders had completely failed. The cooling system had lost over 90% of its coolant. The engine should have seized within 2 minutes of being hit. Instead, it ran for 18 minutes and got me home. That's when I understood why Cam had insisted on the Sabre despite its problems. When you needed it most, it kept running. The Typhoon's reputation evolved from problem child to war-winning weapon between 1942 and 1944. Pilots who had been skeptical became advocates. Commanders who had questioned the program became believers. The aircraft that had nearly been canceled became indispensable to Allied operations. By September 1944, Typhoon squadrons were advancing with Allied ground forces, operating from hastily prepared forward airfields in France. The logistics of supporting these operations were staggering. Each Typhoon required 100 gallons of 100-octane aviation fuel per sortie. Each cannon required 140 rounds of 20mm ammunition. Each rocket attack required 8 RP-3 rockets. Multiplied across 400-plus operational aircraft flying multiple sorties daily, the supply requirements exceeded those of entire infantry divisions. Yet the system worked. Supply aircraft delivered fuel, ammunition, and spare parts to forward airfields. Ground crews worked around the clock, maintaining aircraft under field conditions, often under enemy fire. The Typhoon force maintained operational readiness rates exceeding 75%, unprecedented for an aircraft operating in austere conditions. The German response to the Typhoon threat was systematically inadequate. The Luftwaffe, by late 1944, lacked the resources to challenge Allied air superiority. German fighters were concentrated on defending the Reich from strategic bombers. Ground forces received minimal air support. The few German fighters that engaged Typhoons over the battlefield were overwhelmed by Allied numerical superiority. Flak remained the primary defense against Typhoon attacks, but even this proved insufficient. German flak batteries were constantly targeted by Allied artillery and fighter bombers. Moving flak positions required transport that was itself vulnerable to air attack. The result was a vicious cycle where defending against air attack exposed defenders to more air attacks. Major Georg Peter Ader, commanding Jagdgeschwader 26, engaged Typhoons during the Battle for Arnhem in September 1944. His assessment, recorded in post-war interviews, revealed professional respect tinged with frustration. The Typhoon was not an elegant aircraft like the Spitfire. It was a brute, heavy, powerful, purpose-built for ground attack. Our FW-190s could outturn it, but catching one required perfect circumstances. They operated at low altitude, where we were most vulnerable to Allied fighters. They attacked in coordinated groups supported by Spitfires and Mustangs flying top cover. The worst part was the sound. You could hear them coming from kilometers away, that distinctive engine roar. Our ground forces called them the Terror. They would arrive in waves, attacking anything that moved. Tanks, trucks, staff cars, even individual soldiers. The rockets were devastating. A single hit would destroy our best tanks. I scored 3 kills against Typhoons, all during their attack runs when they were committed and couldn't maneuver. But I lost 4 pilots trying to intercept them. The mathematics were against us. For every Typhoon we destroyed, 10 more appeared. By October 1944, we stopped trying to intercept them during ground attack missions. The cost was too high. The final statistics of Typhoon operations told a story of transformation. The aircraft that had been dismissed as a failure in 1941 had become Britain's most effective ground attack aircraft by 1944. Between D-Day and VE Day, Typhoon squadrons flew 72,000-plus combat sorties, claimed 1,500-plus locomotives destroyed, 4,000-plus vehicles destroyed, 200-plus tanks destroyed, and scored 246 air-to-air victories. The casualty rate remains sobering. Of approximately 3,300 Typhoons built, 1,800 were lost to all causes. This 55% attrition rate exceeded that of any other major RAF aircraft type. Yet squadrons maintained operational capability throughout, testament to Britain's industrial capacity and training pipeline. The human cost was measured in 1,400-plus pilots killed, missing, or captured, representing nearly 100% turnover of the total pilot force required to operate Typhoon squadrons. The average operational life expectancy for Typhoon pilots in 1944 was approximately 4 months. Yet volunteers continued stepping forward, knowing the odds, flying anyway. Wing Commander John Robert Baldwin, DFC in Bar, who had written the letter describing Typhoon operations, was killed on August 16, 1944, during an attack on German armor near Falaise. His Typhoon was hit by flak at 400 feet during the pull-up from a rocket attack. He died instantly when the aircraft crashed into a field. He was 23 years old. His replacement, Flying Officer Thomas Henderson, arrived from the Operational Training Unit 3 days later. Henderson flew 47 operational sorties before being shot down on October 21, 1944. He survived with severe burns and was repatriated in March 1945. His Typhoon was replaced within 24 hours. The system continued functioning regardless of individual casualties. Sidney Cam never flew in a Typhoon. As chief designer, he wasn't permitted to fly operational aircraft, but he visited squadrons regularly, speaking with pilots, studying combat reports, incorporating lessons into ongoing development. The Typhoon Mk-1B, introduced in 1943, featured improved visibility, better cockpit layout, and strengthened airframe. These modifications came directly from pilot feedback. By 1944, CAM was already working on the Typhoon's successor, the Hawker Tempest. This refined version addressed the Typhoon's high-altitude performance limitations while retaining its low-altitude capability. But the Tempest didn't enter service in significant numbers until the war's final months. The Typhoon remained the primary ground attack aircraft throughout 1944 and early 1945. The aircraft that had been built from desperation and scrap, metaphorically if not literally, had proved that sometimes the imperfect solution available immediately beats the perfect solution available eventually. The Typhoon was never the best fighter in any traditional measure. It couldn't outturn the FW-190. It couldn't climb like the Spitfire. It couldn't reach the altitudes where strategic battles were fought. But it could do something no other aircraft could: arrive over the battlefield within minutes, locate and destroy enemy armor, suppress ground defenses, and return to attack again. This capability, dismissed as unnecessary in 1940, proved decisive in 1944. The post-war assessment acknowledged what combat had proven. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, Deputy Supreme Commander Allied Expeditionary Force, wrote in his operational summary, "The Typhoon's contribution to victory in Northwest Europe cannot be overstated. While Spitfires maintained air superiority and heavy bombers struck strategic targets, Typhoons fought the ground battle from the air. They destroyed German armor, disrupted logistics, and made movement in daylight suicidal for enemy forces. The aircraft itself was flawed, maintenance-intensive, difficult to fly, unforgiving of pilot error. But operational effectiveness matters more than technical perfection. The Typhoon was operationally effective beyond any reasonable expectation. It terrified German ground forces in a way strategic bombing never achieved. That psychological impact, combined with actual destruction inflicted, makes the Typhoon one of the war's decisive weapons." The German perspective confirmed this assessment. After the war, captured German commanders were extensively interviewed about Allied capabilities. When asked about the most feared Allied weapon, the response was nearly unanimous: the Typhoon. General der Panzertruppen Heinrich Eberbach, commanding Panzer Group West during Normandy, was blunt. "The Typhoon destroyed more of my tanks than British armor did. We could handle British Shermans. We couldn't handle rockets fired from aircraft we couldn't see until they attacked. The psychological effect was devastating. My tank commanders refused to move in daylight. Some refused to move at all. They would rather face court-martial than face Typhoons." General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy and later the Western Front, placed the Typhoon in strategic context. Britain's production of fighter aircraft exceeded ours from 1942 onward. But numbers alone don't explain Allied air supremacy. The Typhoon represented something we couldn't counter: an aircraft purpose-built for close air support, produced in quantity and employed with tactical innovation. We had nothing equivalent. Our ground attack aircraft, the FW-190F and G variants, were adaptations of fighters designed for other purposes. They lacked the Typhoon's endurance, armament, or survivability. More significantly, we lacked the industrial capacity to produce them in necessary numbers while simultaneously defending the Reich from strategic bombers. The Typhoon terrified our ground forces because it represented unlimited Allied air power applied directly to the battlefield. Every time we concentrated forces for counterattack, Typhoons appeared. Every supply column, every headquarters, every tank park, all were vulnerable. This made coordinated operations impossible. That's how the Typhoon contributed to Germany's defeat, not through destroying everything, though it destroyed much, but by making everything we attempted exponentially more difficult. The post-war fate of the Typhoon was swift and unceremonious. With Germany's surrender in May 1945, the aircraft's primary mission disappeared. Squadrons transitioned to newer aircraft, primarily the Hawker Tempest and early jets. By 1946, most Typhoons were scrapped, their aluminum recycled, their engines salvaged for parts. Of 3,317 Typhoons built, only one survives. Typhoon MN-235 is preserved at the RAF Museum Hendon, restored to flying condition through painstaking effort. The aircraft serves as memorial to the 1,400-plus pilots who died flying Typhoons and to Sidney Cam's refusal to accept conventional wisdom about what was possible. Sidney Cam continued designing aircraft until his death in 1966. His post-war creations included the Hawker Hunter jet fighter, the Hawker Siddeley Harrier jump jet, and numerous experimental designs. He received knighthood in 1953, official recognition of contributions that had already changed aviation history. But Cam rarely discussed the Typhoon in his later years. When asked about his greatest achievement, he would deflect, mentioning the Hurricane or Hunter. Only once in a 1962 interview did he address the Typhoon directly. People call the Typhoon my most difficult project. That's wrong. It was my most necessary project. We needed an aircraft that could be built quickly, operate effectively at low altitude, carry heavy ordnance, and survive combat damage. Every design decision prioritized those requirements over elegance or conventional performance metrics. Yes, it had problems. The engine was unreliable, the structure failed initially, the visibility was poor, but we fixed the fatal issues and accepted the non-fatal ones. Perfection is the enemy of adequacy. The Typhoon was adequate when adequate was desperately needed. I'm proudest not of the aircraft itself, but of the pilots who flew it, knowing the risks. They accepted 50% casualty rates because the mission mattered more than survival. That's not engineering. That's courage beyond anything we designers could create. The Typhoon's legacy extended beyond its direct combat achievements. The tactical systems developed for Typhoon operations, cab rank close air support, forward air controllers, rapid turnaround operations from forward airfields became standard doctrine for air forces worldwide. The rocket projectile proved that air-launched weapons could kill heavy armor, a capability that evolved into modern anti-tank missiles. More fundamentally, the Typhoon proved that specialized aircraft designed for specific missions could outperform general-purpose designs adapted for those missions. This lesson influenced post-war aircraft development, leading to specialized close air support aircraft like the A-10 Thunderbolt II, which inherited both the Typhoon's mission and its controversial reputation for prioritizing effectiveness over elegance. The final accounting reveals a weapon that succeeded not despite its flaws, but by accepting them as necessary trade-offs. The Typhoon was never the aircraft pilots wanted. It was the aircraft they needed. That distinction defined its success and established its place in history. The mad engineer who built it, though Cam would reject that characterization, understood something fundamental about wartime aviation. The aircraft that exists and works adequately defeats the aircraft that exists only as perfect specifications on drawing boards. The Typhoon existed. It worked. German armor commanders and infantry feared it more than any Allied weapon. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. The Typhoon proved that desperation and genius, combined with industrial will, could create weapons that changed warfare. Not through revolutionary technology, the Typhoon used conventional materials and established techniques, but through unconventional application of existing capabilities. The aircraft that terrified the Nazis was built from parts they understood, using engines they could have built, employing tactics they could have copied, but they didn't. Britain did. Sidney Cam did, and 1,400 pilots paid the price to make it work. Their memorial stands in a museum in North London, one surviving aircraft representing thousands built and lost, Visitors can see the thick wings that held fuel and rockets, the massive engine that provided brutal power at low altitude, the cramped cockpit where young men sat while hunting German armor, the aluminum skin that absorbed flak and kept flying. They can imagine, if they try, the sound of that Sabre engine, the thundering roar that German soldiers learned to fear. They can picture formations of Typhoons diving on panzer columns, rockets streaking toward targets, pilots pulling up through walls of flak, some making it home, others falling in flames. But standing in the quiet museum, surrounded by polished aircraft and educational displays, it's impossible to truly comprehend what those pilots experienced. The fear, the adrenaline, the split-second decisions between life and death. The knowledge that your aircraft might kill you before the enemy did. The acceptance that your operational life expectancy could be measured in weeks. Squadron leader Pierre Clostermann, a Free French pilot who flew Typhoons with No. 3 Squadron RAF in 1944-45, captured this reality in his post-war memoir. The Typhoon was not an aircraft you flew with affection. You flew it with respect and caution. It demanded constant attention. The engine required careful management. The controls were heavy, requiring physical strength during high-speed maneuvers. Landing required absolute concentration. One mistake and you'd ground loop, or worse. But when you pressed the firing button and 8 rockets leapt from your wings, when you watched the Panther tank explode from a direct hit, when you climbed away while German soldiers scattered in panic, in those moments you understood why the Typhoon existed. It was a weapon, pure and simple. Not a sports car or a precision instrument. A weapon designed to destroy ground targets regardless of cost. I lost 12 squadron mates in 4 months, some to flak, some to mechanical failures, 1 to mid-air collision, 2 simply disappeared, never found, never explained. Yet every morning we flew again, because German armor was moving, and only we could stop it. The Typhoon made that possible. Nothing else could. The statistical analysis of Typhoon effectiveness reveals patterns that contradict conventional assumptions about air power. During the Normandy campaign, Typhoon squadrons claimed 137 German tanks destroyed. Post-war analysis of German records suggested the actual number was closer to 40 to 50 confirmed kills. This discrepancy, common in air-to-ground combat assessments, initially seemed to diminish the Typhoon's achievement. But subsequent research revealed a more complex reality. Many German tanks claimed as destroyed by Typhoons were actually abandoned by crews after being damaged or immobilized. The psychological impact of rocket attacks caused tank crews to evacuate vehicles that could have been repaired. Other tanks were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture after being isolated by air attacks that destroyed supporting vehicles. The indirect effects exceeded direct destruction. German armor couldn't concentrate for counterattacks without triggering immediate airstrikes. Supply vehicles couldn't reach forward units in daylight. Command posts had to relocate constantly to avoid detection. The cumulative effect was paralysis of German mobile warfare doctrine. General der Panzertruppen Leo Gehr von Schweppenberg, whose Panzer Group West was shattered during the Normandy campaign, explained in post-war debriefing, "We didn't need every tank destroyed to lose operational capability. When half our armor was destroyed or damaged, when our supply lines were interdicted, when our movements were constantly disrupted by air attacks, we couldn't function as an armored force. The Typhoon achieved this not through perfect accuracy, but through persistent presence. We knew that any movement, any concentration would bring them. That knowledge was as effective as actual destruction." The technological legacy of the Typhoon extended into the jet age in unexpected ways. The structural lessons learned from the tail separation failures influenced British jet fighter design. The rocket projectile system developed for the Typhoon became the template for post-war air-to-ground rockets used by multiple nations. The cab-rank close air support system pioneered with Typhoons became NATO doctrine that persisted through the Cold War. More subtly, the Typhoon proved that specialized ground attack aircraft required different design priorities than air superiority fighters. Post-war air forces initially rejected this lesson, pursuing multi-role fighters that could perform both missions adequately. But by the 1970s, specialized close air support aircraft re-emerged: the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Su-25 Frogfoot, the AMX International. All trace their conceptual lineage to the Typhoon's mission profile. The Napier Sabre engine, despite its troubled service history, represented the zenith of piston engine development. The H-24 configuration produced more power per unit volume than any production piston engine before or since. Post-war variants produced 3,500 horsepower on test stands, more than entire bomber formations from just 15 years earlier. But the Sabre's complexity made it obsolete almost immediately after the war. Jet engines, simpler to build and maintain, produced comparable power from smaller packages. The sleeve valve technology that made the Sabre possible was abandoned. The last Sabre engines were scrapped in the 1950s. Today, only a handful survive in museums, testament to an evolutionary dead end that nonetheless served its purpose when needed. The human stories behind the statistics provide context that numbers alone cannot convey. Flying Officer John Jack Collins, a Canadian pilot flying Typhoons with number 439 Squadron RCAF, survived 63 operational sorties, far exceeding the average operational life expectancy. His diary, donated to the Canadian War Museum, documents the psychological toll. March 15th, 1945. Lost Morrison today. Flak got him during an attack on a convoy near Rhine. Saw his Typhoon exploded 500 feet. No parachute. He'd been with the squadron for 3 weeks. Can't remember what he looked like. They're replacing him tomorrow with a kid from Ontario. Hope he lasts longer. March 23rd. Attacked a Panther tank near Wessel. Hit it square with 2 rockets. Turret flew 20 feet in the air. Felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not horror. Just marked it on my map and looked for the next target. What's happening to me? April 4. The new kid, Jenkins, I think, asked me how many missions until he'd stop being scared. Told him the fear never stops. You just learn to function through it. He looked disappointed. What did he expect? This isn't glorious. It's necessary. April 16th. Jerry surrendered in our sector today. Flew one last mission, armed reconnaissance, found nothing worth shooting. Came back, landed, shut down the engine. Sat in the cockpit for 10 minutes trying to remember why I'd been so afraid yesterday. Can't remember. Just feel empty. Collins survived the war, returned to Canada, and never flew again. He worked as an accountant in Toronto until his death in 1987. His Typhoon, MN-987, was scrapped in June 1945. The aluminum was recycled. No records indicate what it became. The financial cost of the Typhoon program provides perspective on Britain's commitment despite the aircraft's problems. Each Typhoon cost approximately £7,500 to build in 1944, roughly $30,000 at contemporary exchange rates. This exceeded the cost of a Hurricane by 40% and a Spitfire Mark V by 25%. The total program cost, including development, production, and operational support, exceeded £30 million, equivalent to over $2 billion in 2025 dollars. For a nation fighting for survival, this represented an enormous investment in an aircraft that wasn't clearly superior to alternatives until late 1943. But the return on investment, measured in German tanks destroyed, supply lines interdicted, and tactical flexibility provided to Allied ground forces, exceeded any reasonable calculation. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding Allied ground forces in Northwest Europe, acknowledged this in his post-war memoirs. The Typhoon squadrons provided capabilities that artillery could not match. They could strike targets 20 miles behind enemy lines within minutes of being called. They could destroy individual tanks with precision impossible for artillery. Most importantly, they could observe the battlefield and provide intelligence that ground reconnaissance could never obtain. The cost was high, both in aircraft losses and financial investment. But without the Typhoon, the Normandy breakout would have taken weeks longer. Without the Typhoon, German counterattacks would have been more effective. Without the Typhoon, our casualties would have been significantly higher. The investment was justified by results. The Soviet assessment of the Typhoon, based on intelligence reports and captured German accounts, was characteristically blunt. A 1945 analysis by Soviet aviation intelligence concluded the British Typhoon represents specialized application of air power to the ground support role. Aircraft possesses inadequate performance for air superiority missions, but exceptional capability for ground attack. British willingness to accept specialized aircraft for specific roles demonstrates strategic flexibility that Germany lacked. Soviet aviation should develop similar specialized ground attack aircraft. The current practice of adapting fighters for ground attack produces inadequate results. Typhoon proves that purpose-built design with heavy armament, armor protection, and adequate payload can achieve tactical results impossible for adapted fighters. This assessment influenced Soviet post-war development of specialized ground attack aircraft, particularly the IL-10 and subsequent Sukhoi designs. The legacy of Sidney Cam's desperate improvisation thus extended into Cold War Soviet doctrine. The final missions flown by Typhoon squadrons occurred in early May 1945 as German resistance collapsed. Number 184 Squadron RAF flew the last recorded Typhoon combat sortie on May 4, 1945, an armed reconnaissance mission over northern Germany that encountered no targets. The squadron's operations book record the anticlimax. Mission completed without incident, no enemy activity observed. Weather clear, all aircraft returned safely. 5 days later, Germany surrendered. The Typhoon's war was over. Squadrons began the process of transitioning to jet aircraft or disbanding entirely. Ground crews began inventorying aircraft for disposition. Some would be retained for training, most would be scrapped, a handful would be preserved as memorials. At Hawker's Kingston facility, Sidney Cam was already working on the next generation. The Hawker P-1040, which would evolve into the Seahawk jet fighter, represented a clean sheet design incorporating lessons learned from the Typhoon program. But Cam reportedly kept a photograph of a Typhoon on his office wall until his retirement, a reminder of what could be achieved when necessity demanded innovation regardless of conventional wisdom. The mad engineer, though Cam would have bristled at the characterization, preferring pragmatic or results-oriented, had proved that limitations could become advantages when properly exploited. The Typhoon's thick wing, initially criticized for creating drag, provided internal volume for fuel and hardpoints for ordnance. The problematic Sabre engine, when it worked, provided power no other power plant could match at low altitude. The heavy airframe, criticized for reducing maneuverability, provided survivability that saved countless pilots. Every limitation was accepted, worked around, or exploited. Every problem that couldn't be fixed was managed. Every compromise was justified by operational results. This pragmatism, this refusal to let the perfect destroy the adequate, defined both the aircraft and its creator. In the decades following the war, aviation historians debated the Typhoon's place in the pantheon of legendary aircraft. It lacked the Spitfire's elegance, the P-51 Mustang's range, the B-17's fame, the Me-262's revolutionary technology. What it possessed was effectiveness in a specific, critical mission at a specific critical time. Wing Commander Roland Beaumont, who had defended the Typhoon during its darkest days and who survived the war to become a renowned test pilot, summarized its legacy in a 1975 interview. History judges aircraft by how well they performed their intended mission. By that measure, the Typhoon ranks among the most successful combat aircraft ever built. It did exactly what it was designed to do, provide devastating ground attack capability that could be deployed rapidly and effectively in support of ground operations. Was it elegant? No. Was it easy to fly? No. Was it reliable? Not initially. But was it effective? Absolutely. More effective than anything else available for its mission. That's what mattered. That's what winning required. Sidney Cam understood something that many designers miss. Operational effectiveness matters more than technical perfection. A flawed aircraft that exists and works is superior to a perfect aircraft that exists only on paper. The Typhoon existed. It worked. It won. That's sufficient legacy for any aircraft. The German soldiers who survived encounters with Typhoons carried memories that lasted lifetimes. In 1984, at a reunion of Wehrmacht veterans in Stuttgart, former Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt was asked about his most fearful wartime experience. His answer surprised those who knew he had fought on the Eastern Front. Not the Russians, not the winter of '42, not Stalingrad. The worst was France in summer of '44, sitting in a Panther tank, hearing those engines coming. That sound, nothing else sounded like a Typhoon. Deep, powerful, angry. You knew they were hunting. We would scatter, try to find cover, anything to hide from their rockets, but they would find us anyway. They always did. I was hit twice. Once the rocket hit our tank's engine, once it destroyed the track. Both times I evacuated and survived. Many comrades didn't. They died in burning tanks, hit by weapons fired from aircraft they never saw until it was too late. After the war, I became an engineer. I studied aviation. I learned about the Typhoon's development, its problems, its limitations, and I understood that we had been terrorized by an aircraft that was barely adequate by peacetime standards. That's when I realized we never had a chance. If Britain could make something like the Typhoon work despite its flaws, they could make anything work. That level of determination cannot be defeated. The last word belongs to the anonymous pilot of Typhoon MN235, the sole survivor preserved at RAF Museum Hendon. Records indicate the aircraft was flown by at least 17 different pilots during its operational service from September 1944 to March 1945. 3 of those pilots were killed in other aircraft, 2 were wounded, the rest survived the war. One of them, identity unknown as his logbook was never found, chalked a message on the inside of the cockpit canopy that was discovered during restoration. "This bastard saved my life 3 times. Forgive her everything else." That sentiment, crude but heartfelt, captures the Typhoon's essence better than any technical manual or official history. It was difficult, temperamental, dangerous to fly, and marginally reliable. But when it mattered, when flak was coming up in streams, when German armor was advancing, when the mission required reaching the target regardless of cost, it worked. The mad engineer who built it from desperation and determination created not an aircraft to be loved, but an aircraft to be trusted. In war, trust matters more than affection. The 1,400 pilots who died flying Typhoons trusted their aircraft to give them a fighting chance. Most times it did. Sometimes it didn't. But it always tried. That's the legacy. Not perfection, but persistent effort. Not elegance, but effectiveness. Not beauty, but brutal functionality applied to winning a war that had to be won. Sidney Cam built an aircraft that terrified the Nazis, not through superior technology or revolutionary design, but through relentless prosecution of a specific mission regardless of cost. The Typhoon wasn't the best aircraft of World War II by any conventional measure, but for the mission it flew, low-altitude ground attack in support of Allied armies breaking German defensive positions, nothing was better. The terror it inspired in German ground forces came not from its capabilities alone, but from what those capabilities represented. Unlimited Allied resources applied with surgical precision to tactical problems. Every Typhoon overhead represented Allied air supremacy, industrial capacity, and operational competence that Germany could not match. The aircraft that wasn't supposed to exist, that nearly failed in development, that killed almost as many of its pilots through mechanical failures as enemy action in its first year of service, became the most feared Allied weapon in the ground war. That transformation from failure to legend represents the ultimate vindication of Sidney Cam's vision. In the quiet museum where the last Typhoon rests, visitors can read the placard describing its specifications and service history. What they cannot read, what can never be fully captured in words, is the sound of that Sabre engine announcing death from above, the sight of 8 rockets streaking toward German armor, the desperate courage of pilots who flew it knowing the odds but flying anyway. The mad engineer built a plane from determination and necessity. The brave pilots flew it from duty and desperation. Together, they created a legend from scraps of aluminum and enormous quantities of courage. The Typhoon didn't win the war alone, but without it, the war would have lasted longer, cost more lives, ended differently. That hypothetical is sufficient proof of its value. Sidney Cam was right. Operational effectiveness matters more than technical perfection. The Typhoon was operationally effective when effectiveness was desperately needed. It terrified the Nazis, not through tricks or propaganda, but through simple, brutal, persistent presence over every battlefield where German armies tried to resist. They heard it coming. They couldn't stop it. They learned to fear it more than artillery, more than tanks, more than anything else Allied forces deployed. An aircraft built from scrap and genius, flown by young men who knew the risks, had achieved what conventional wisdom said was impossible. That's the story. That's the legacy. That's why one aircraft survives in a museum while 3,316 others were scrapped, so that future generations can see the machine that proved determination and pragmatism defeat perfection and theory every time. The mad engineer who built it would have rejected the romanticization. He would have pointed to production numbers, operational statistics, and mission effectiveness. He would have insisted it was simply good engineering applied to a difficult problem. But the German soldiers who survived encounters with Typhoons knew the truth. Sometimes genius looks like madness until it wins. Sidney Cam's greatest achievement was understanding that winning mattered more than being right, that results justified compromises, that the aircraft that exists and works defeats the aircraft that might be perfect someday. The Typhoon existed. It worked. It won. The Nazis learned to fear it. That's sufficient epitaph for any weapon of war.